Hey guys, another video devotion on the attributes of God. We've got a couple more before we finish out this series. And tonight I want to talk about God's omnipotence. Omni means all, and the potence part of that is speaking of God's power. He is an all-powerful God. And what does this mean? That He is all-powerful. There was a song back in the 90s, a Christian song that is still just a great song. Has all of the hallmarks of a 90s song by Rich Mullins called Awesome God. And in it, just the opening lines kind of captures some of the imagery of this for us. It says, when He rolls up His sleeves, He ain't just putting on the Ritz. Our God is an awesome God. There is thunder in His footsteps and lightning in His fists. Our God is an awesome God. Just attempts at trying to describe the omnipotence of our God. The Bible does the same sort of things. It describes His displays of power like at Mount Sinai with bolts of lightning and rumbles of thunder and shouts from the trumpet and earthquakes and all of these sorts of things. But in reality, these are just minor manifestations of His power. If we're speaking of a being that has the power to create everything that is in existence, then a single mountain on the Sinai Peninsula that happens to have volcanic activity, at least something that sounds like volcanic activity, is barely a representation of His power. Although from humans' perspective, observing it, we are dwarfed by such things. But when we encounter things like this, maybe it's a volcano or it's a hurricane or it's the Grand Canyon or it's a tornado, or something like this, it should remind us that we are dwarfed in comparison to the God who created such things. I mean, this God is so mighty that He created the sun, which is 93 million miles away, and here we are on earth. We can't even look at it for any more than a second without damaging our eyes and feeling extreme pain in our eyes, and let alone the God who created this. These are just examples of what He is like. When the Bible uses language to describe Him, it says, for instance, in Psalm 24:8, the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Or Genesis 18:14, is anything too hard for the Lord? Jeremiah 32:17 makes that statement in the positive, there is nothing too hard for you. When we are speaking of God's omnipotence and His all-powerfulness, His might, we need a definition to describe this, because what we are not saying is that God can do anything at all. This is incredibly important for us to understand. A good definition of this would be that God's omnipotence means that God is able to do all His holy will. And the word holy is very important there. So what God is not able to do are things that are contrary to His nature. We have talked about this in a previous video. For instance, it is clear biblically that God cannot lie. So Titus 1:2 says that, literally calls Him the unlying God, the God who never lies. Or Hebrews 6:18 says it is impossible for God to lie. We discover in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 13 that it is impossible for God to deny Himself. Or we discover in James 1:13 that God cannot be tempted with evil. So these are just a few things that it is in fact impossible for God to do. Other things it's impossible for God to do is to do things that are, you might say, contrary to logic itself, to His created sequence of how things logically are structured. So God cannot make a round square or a square circle. God cannot make 2 + 2 = 5. You say, well, He could materialize a third thing to make 5. Well, then you'd have 2 + 3 = 5. So God cannot violate the laws, such as the law of logic that He has put into the universe. And so these are examples of things that God cannot do. But within His nature and His character, God is without bounds in terms of His might. We discover in Luke 1:37, with God nothing will be impossible, or Matthew 9:26, with God all things are possible. And so God is a very mighty God, so mighty that He is able to create stars and galaxies and billions of these. So mighty that he is able to raise Jesus from the dead. He is able to materialize out of thin air fishes and loaves. He is able to cause whirlwinds and hurricanes and the like. And yet, what I find that is incredibly important for us to zero in on this is while we should be greatly encouraged by the fact that God is all powerful, we need to remind ourselves that power, as good as this is, to remember that God has this incredible might, that it is not power that God wishes to define himself by. We talked about this in the video where I described the love of God. Nowhere in the Bible does it say God is power. It says, though, that God is love. To finish this discussion on God's power, I want you to understand the importance of this. If the Bible said that God is power, then power would be the most important thing in the universe. That would mean that what Adolf Hitler pursued and what Joseph Stalin pursued, well, they were pursuing after the most important thing in the universe. It's not. Love is the most foundational reality in all of the universe. And it is by love that God's power is qualified and defined. Love is the definition of, is sort of the fabric underneath all reality. And God's power ensures that his love will never be thwarted and his good purposes will never be changed. It is God's power that ensured that the crucifixion of Jesus would be sufficient for the payment of all sins. It is God's power that ensured that he would not stay dead, but would indeed rise from the dead. God bless. Have a good night.